don't know. My name is the Lord. And I'm walking here. I'm walking here.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Groovy.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Box Office Pulp, your one-stop podcast for movies, madness, and moxie. I'm your host, Cody. Joining me today are my co-hosts, Mike and Jamie. But who cares about them? We have a special guest. That's 2 weeks in a row. I can't believe our luck. We've got with us today J. Blake Fichera, the author of Scored to Death and Scored to Death 2. Plus, would it be fair to kind of call you a jack of all trades? I see you like you've got a ton of editing credits on IMDb, a handful of acting credits. A little bit of everything, plus a new Kickstarter you're the director of. Like, you're kind of on everything.
I keep busy, that's for sure.
I feel like if I ever had a kick, like an IMDb page, it'd just say like, who's around?
Yeah,
Before we actually get into things, I'm really excited. We just saw that you were in Harold and Kumar, and we all got really excited.
Well, I'll say if you watch the movie, you won't see me in it. Let's just put it that way. Unfortunately, I hate to burst your bubble.
Oh man, it's okay. You could have lied to me. I think it's a Christmas movie, so I would have forgotten by then. But I'm sorry to interrupt. But yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. I absolutely love both Scored to Death books, and I can't wait for your latest project, the Kickstarter you've got going to do an actual Scored to Death kind of documentary.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, the books were a labor of love to begin with. I was very lucky to be able to do them and get so many people involved in them. For people that don't know, the books are a collection of interviews, pretty in-depth interviews that I did with, between the two books, 30 film composers that have made significant contributions to the horror genre. And I've already started filming, but right now, through November 1st, we're trying to raise money to keep filming a Scored to Death documentary called Scored to Death, The Dark Art of Scary Movie Music. And it's not really, I guess that the common term would be that it's based on the books, but it's really just kind of a new an exploration of scary movie music like the books were, but in a totally different way. Like the plan is not to make the books like not to make the movie an abridged version of the books. It's to kind of explore horror film music in a way that I wasn't able to explore it with the books. So I'm pretty excited about it.
So with the documentary segments, are you able to actually get any of their score for those? Is that kind of considered a fair use thing? Well,
the hope is that, the videos that I've been posting online are pretty liberal in terms of how I've been using them. It will be an issue with the documentary. So the hope is that we will be able to be very strategic about how we use everything and be able to fit everything under fair use. But that's going to be, to do that, we're going to need a very good lawyer that specializes in that kind of thing. Because a movie like this it would cost way too much to try to do it, just as willy-nilly, so
sure.
But the way that I plan on doing it, I think it's, a very realistic that we can make something really special, with fair use, because so much of it is going to be about how music works within horror movies. And of course we're going to discuss some of the greatest or most popular scores in horror movie history. But I think the way we're going about it and how they're going to be discussed, I think it's I feel good about being able to do it fair use and be able to still deliver a product that's going to be really special and great.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, isn't one of the rewards on the Kickstarter, if you pledge enough, kind of a compilation CD that comes along with?
Yeah, when I was trying to set up the Kickstarter, a lot of campaigns promise a soundtrack album, and not knowing how much money I'd be able to raise, I didn't know if I'd be able to afford to hire a composer to do a score, an original score for the documentary itself, or else or if I'd have to use library cues, and in that case, I wouldn't be able to release an album. So what I did was I thought of what can I release? Because obviously it's a project about film music, and film music has such a huge collector's base, including myself. So I thought, like a compilation of covers of horror movie themes would be really cool. So I just started reaching out to composers and musicians and bands that I liked and that I wanted to hear do covers of things. And to my surprise, many said yes. So exclusively through the Kickstarter is a limited edition album, Scored to Death album of horror movie covers on both CD and vinyl, with a plethora of great composers like Alan Howarth, Wojciech Golczewski, the band Voyager, the band Anima Morte, Steve Moore from the band Zombie, Holly Amber Church, who's in the documentary and in the second book, the Blair Brothers. If I'm forgetting anybody off the top of my head, I apologize, but there's been a fantastic lineup of people have agreed out of the kindness of their heart and their belief in the project to record new versions of popular, and sometimes I wouldn't say some of them are not popular, but are awesome in like a very cultish kind of way, horror themes, and donating them exclusively to this compilation album for the movie. So it just goes to show you, it never hurts to ask.
100%.
And that there are some truly wonderfully generous people out there willing to support cool projects.
Oh, that's so exciting. And I mean, right now is especially kind of a big swing for vinyl. It seems like sales have increased every single year for the past decade. So it's a format that's surged. Plus, I mean, with all the stuff like on Waxworks, like all the special collector's editions for horror vinyl, it's amazing all the stuff that's out there right now.
It's really, that all kind of, it's funny. When I started the original book, the first Scored to Death book, Scored to Death Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers, I started it in super late 2013. And then it came out in summer of 2016. So I kind of started it right at the cusp of that. I think Mondo and Death Waltz had started releasing stuff. I'm not sure that Waxwork had released anything yet by the time, they did while I was doing it, but I don't think they did when I started. So by the time the book came out in 2016, there were all these labels and there was all these fantastic releases, and John Carpenter was on tour. It was like the first book, the first book came out like on the crest of this wave of popularity in horror film music. So in that sense, I got timing right for the first book.
Yeah. Well, and timing for the documentary seems like it's pretty strong too, because we have so many really great kind of long form horror documentaries hitting the shelves. I think there's definitely a hunger from fans for something a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm beginning to think that unfortunately maybe October was not the best time to run a Kickstarter campaign for it, because I think it's getting a little bit lost in the shuffle of publicity for other horror-related things. If I were to do it over again, I don't know if I would have done it right now. But it was like either that, or I didn't want to wait till like November or December, because then it was the holidays and people are
right
spending money on that and traveling. And then it was like, okay, well then am I waiting till next year to start, raising money for it? And so
I got the same problem as movie studios. You just need to dump it in January, and that's when people show up.
Yeah. I started shooting I shot the first 5 interviews in June. I flew out to California to do that. Luckily, through doing the books, I've been able to form relationships and friendships with the many amazing composers. And so I knew that for the Kickstarter campaign, I would need something to show as to what we were trying to do and some of the people involved. So I flew out to LA in June, shot basically 5 interviews in 5 days, and then I flew back to New York. And then if you visit the campaign or you follow me on social media and you're seeing videos from the movie, that's all stuff from the first 5 interviews I shot. And there are other composers that have signed on, like Christopher Young and John Massari and Alan Howarth, who I didn't have a chance to interview yet. And I didn't reach out to too many more because it's really going to depend on whether we can raise enough money to keep going and how much money we raise. I didn't want to kind of pack the cast before we really knew what kind of film we were going to be able to make with the budget. Like, I didn't want to approach John Carpenter with like hopefully we'll be able to make this movie. Will you be in it?
Right.
You know,
It's like approaching the Wizard of Oz. Like, we have to be as impressive as possible.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure we had an actual thing. You know, like we were, you know, greenlit, for lack of a better term. So, you know, the hope is I don't want to be I'm trying to avoid being a documentary that has like 400 people in the cast, you know, like hear from, and I want it to be I'm going to try to keep it to a good 90 minutes, 2 hours. And I want everybody to, you know, have a good role in it. So I'm trying to be pretty selective of the amount of people that go in it. But I definitely would love, you know, the plan is to get more involved than are currently kind of signed on to be in it. It just, it's a whole, you know, I'm figuring it all out, but there's going to be much more than like the, you know, 7, 8 people that have already signed on.
But yeah, I mean, in the first book, the interview with Christopher Young was, I mean, he's so entertaining on the page. I can't wait to actually see him, like, you know, do a video interview. So that's exciting. Get that part in there. Yeah,
Chris is amazing. Many people have told me that their favorite interview in the first book is Chris's. And I think a lot of that has to do with how honest he is about his career and his inter conflicts with his career and being a horror composer. I feel like that interview was really kind of raw in some ways. That interview was made up of maybe 3 interviews that we did together over a period of time when I was doing them. But Chris is, because of that, since then, Chris has become a wonderful close friend. He wrote the afterword for the second book. And he's just one of my favorite people of all time. He's literally like give you a shirt off his back kind of guy. So I'm excited I wasn't able to interview him when I went out in June, but he and I are both looking forward to sitting down and chatting again.
That's going to be great. So you mentioned for the book, originally you had to kind of piece together 3 different interviews. Most of the interviews in the books are around 20 some pages? Like, did you have to do all of those kind of in different segments, or did some people just sit down and talk to you straight for a couple of hours to get all of that?
It was mostly, I'd say the vast majority of the interviews for both books were single interviews. Harry Manfredini, who's best known for the Friday the 13th movies, he was the first interview I did. And I ended up, you know, by the time I was finishing the book, like 2 years had passed. So I interviewed him again, because by then he was working on the video game. So I mean, I did updates on some of the early ones. Carpenter was another one that I interviewed once for about for about an hour. And then during that interview, I was like, do you ever think about doing an album of non-soundtrack music? And he's like, no. And then by the time
3 albums later,
and then by the time I was finishing the book, he had an album. So I interviewed him again about that. But most of them, like Charlie Clouser, for instance, who's in the second book, who's best known for the Saw movies, he and I sat on Zoom or Skype for 4.5 hours and just talked straight. And one conversation, it was literally like 4 to 4.5 hours, and we did it in that, and I ended up cutting it down quite a bit. Not because, just because like how long can the book be? It was more for time than anything else.
Right.
So there's like a handful, and some of them, especially when there's a language barrier, were done via email. Like the Japanese composers in the second book and Fabio Frizzi in the first book. So it was an interesting experience because not only are they all different in the way they approach things, kind of unique, but how I had to go about interviewing everybody was pretty unique to everybody as well. So I think the reason why I ended up calling it Conversations with some of horror's greatest composers is because I feel like for the most part that's how they read. That's how they turned out. Less interviews and more conversation. I actually think the second book even more so because by the second book I had done it already, and I also by that point was friends with a number of the composers from the first book, and I got a lot of the composers for the second book through those friendships. And I just think that the way I approached it and the way I felt about it in a subconscious way was very different. Like I was less of a fan going into the second book, and I think I felt more comfortable and more like a peer in a weird way when I did the second book. So in some ways I feel like the second book is even better than the first book, because I think I was a better interviewer by the second book.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm I spent a lot of time on both of them, and I'm extremely proud of how they came out. But I've always thought of the books as not being really mine, but being ours, with the composers. They were, obviously they're the bulk of it, maybe I talk for 5%, 10% of what's actually in the book. And it's these people who are incredibly generous with their time. In some cases, brutally honest. And it was a great experience, and it's why I keep doing it. It's somebody who I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were asking me about it. And I said, I kind of keep doing it because I still find it really interesting. and that's why I'm doing the movie too. I think it's a topic that's fascinating. I think it's a topic that is underappreciated, even for a lot of horror fans. And I think the people that do it are underappreciated. And so when I started doing the first book, I realized that, yes, the genesis of the books was there was information I wanted to know, and that's why I did it. This book didn't exist, and I wanted to read this book, so I decided to do it myself. But I realized as I was doing it that it was kind of important to promote and celebrate the people who do this work that I love. And the work itself, but it became really important to me to be able to, for people who aren't diehard horror music fans, to be able to put a name and even a face to the work that they've been listening to forever.
And, I think you can really see the enthusiasm even in the written conversations, because you think of it all the time. When a movie comes out, they want to talk to the actors, they want to talk to the director, and then the composer maybe gets a very short interview or a couple of pull quotes. So for them to get time to really express themselves, I imagine that had to be exciting on their end.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, everybody has a different temperament of, some people are very talkative and some people aren't. But I think they were all enthusiastic and supportive of the books, because I think they appreciated what I was trying to do. And especially when we did the interviews, I think they realized really what I was trying to do. And, many of them have told me that the interviews they did for my books are either the favorite interview they've ever done, or they've said, "Oh, you asked me things that nobody's ever asked me before." And so, I mean, obviously those things are amazing and flattering, but I think when they realized that what I was really trying to do, a lot of them opened up even more, because I think they saw the opportunity, not just to celebrate the art form and the craft and everything, but to have a platform to tell their stories and explain their craft. And I think the books especially can be very educational for people that want to do film scoring or music composing in general, because a lot of it is about process and how they approach it. And the books it was fascinating and interesting to do. And, I think the books are great, but they're not. I emphasize they're not as much great because of me. They're great because of the people I was able to get involved, and the time and openness they were willing to lend to the project. I was very lucky.
That's what makes it.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I'm sorry.
I keep cutting you off.
That's what makes it so tragic that so many film composers are limited to just, a 15-second blurb on an old DVD featurette here and there, or the occasional short interview, because so many of these guys have fascinating backstories outside of even their composing career. We hear so many Hollywood stories that are often very A to B to C, but the road that leads to someone composing film music, specifically composing horror film music, will often be like really twisted.
Some of them, a lot of them, I think, talking to Harry Manfredini about, being known for it. And he's always like, you grow where you're planted, some of the guys of his generation, the people who kind of got their career started in the 70s and 80s, their goal was never really to score horror movies. It's just they took a job and that job had success and they got kind of, pigeonholed into it. In contrast of younger people like Joseph Bishara and Holly Amber Church and even Nathan Barr, who does a lot of different kinds of stuff, and Bear McCreary, who does all kinds of stuff, but they have an appreciation for horror that I feel like a lot of the composers of the 70s and 80s didn't have when they started. I think they developed an appreciation for the genre and how music works within that genre, but because they didn't grow up in a time when horror music was so big, it's the more contemporary generations that I think are more excited about doing it. But yeah, they all have fascinating stories. I mean, at the end of the day, like everybody's story is kind of interesting, and it's just a matter of giving people a platform to tell it in a way that kind of emphasizes how interesting it is. But when it comes to film music, yeah, it's unfortunate. I forget who I was talking to. It was, I think, one of the interviews. Maybe it was when I was talking to Richard Band, and he was saying that at some point there was some kind of lawsuit in France, and it had to be decided like who are the true creative minds, like the true creative people of who makes a film. I don't know what the lawsuit was and all that, but it was, according to him, it was decided that the three creators of a film are the writer, the director, and the composer. And I think it's true because I think music, obviously it's underappreciated because when it's done right, it's truly invisible and not always noticeable. But it does so much for a film, and in most cases, it's the only part of the film that the director can't really do themselves or understand. So they need it. They need somebody to come in and do it. And a lot of what we talk about in the books is that relationship because, John Carpenter is kind of an anomaly, but for the most part, like a director doesn't know anything about, composing music. So it's something that they really have to rely on another person to do. Whereas a lot of filmmakers, especially ones that came out of the film school generation, like they could shoot the movie if they need to, or they could light a scene if they wanted to, and they could write a movie. But most of them would have no idea where to start when it came to scoring the movie. So it's an incredibly important role for the person. And it's also unique in terms of music because when we think of popular music and songwriting, so much of that kind of stuff is self-expression, whether they're either writing it or or if they're writer performers. But in the case of a movie or a play, when you have to put music on something that somebody else created for dramatic purposes, I think it's a really unique relationship for a composer because they're not doing it for themselves. They actually have to do it for somebody else. And what they do is in service to not just the filmmaker and the writer, but the movie itself. And so there's an interesting balance of like satisfying themselves with the work, but also doing it for no other reason but for somebody else. So it's all really interesting stuff that I've come to really appreciate even more through this almost decade now of interviewing composers and learning about it.
Well, I remember in your interview in part 2 with Disaster Piece, there's a whole bunch of mentions of the fact that the temp track really kind of guided the entire score for It Follows, which is fascinating because you hear that score and you think, oh, wow, there's not a lot else like this necessarily. And you realize, like, oh, it's actually kind of being fashioned around some of his previous work, some of the other works that the director enjoyed. It wasn't necessarily all, something he just wrought out of his head out of the blue. It was very, very much guided.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example of the variety of point of views that you get from these composers that are really evident in the book, because when you have, I'm going to call them the older generation, but they're the older generation of the people interviewed for the book. Most of them can't stand a temp score, a temp track. They don't want to hear it at all. If they have to hear it, they only want to hear it once. But you get someone like Disasterpiece who's coming from a totally different direction, a totally different part of film music. I mean, music in general, coming to film music from a totally unique, other kind of music compared to everybody else. And for him, it was a very useful tool. And even Charlie Clouser, who's kind of in the middle generation wise of the people I've interviewed, he's pretty open to it, and he finds it to be useful too. Maybe not as much of a template as Disasterpiece kind of found it to be, but he's someone who's has said if the filmmaker has an idea of what they want it to be, if that's how they can tell me how they want it to be, I'm all for it. I'll do my best to figure out what it is. And not all of them have to deal with it, especially nowadays, but some of them loathe it. And some of them, some of them, I don't even want to talk to them about it, because I know it's slowly I turn step by step. But I won't even ask about it. And some of them will bring it up. Let me tell you, before we move on to the next question, let me tell you about the temp tracks. And I was like, okay. So some of them really hate it, but some of them, that's the kind of the beauty of it, I think. And when you see them all compiled in collections like the books are, I find it fascinating, obviously, how differently they approach it, but also how similarly some of them approach it, that you don't really get to see when you just read, a short interview in a magazine, or see an interview on a special feature or something. When you get to sit there and just read all of them, and even if you don't need to do it in order, I think it's interesting when you start seeing kind of the differences and the similarities between them.
Well, for me, it's great kind of getting those nitty-gritty details, because I played a tuba in high school for a couple of years. I'm not much of a musician. I don't really know what's going on for film production scores. But as an avid film fan, you see articles all the time that kind of just pretend to know what's going on, or pretend you know what's going on. I remember seeing an article a few years back claiming that temp scores were ruining all the music in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And not knowing anything about temp music myself at the time, you just kind of read that and go, oh, wow, I can't believe that's destroying the scores. And I'm sure if you talk to composers, they'd be like, here's 40 reasons why that is just a gross oversimplification. So it's very fun in the interviews to get that kind of stuff in those details.
Yeah, and I think Jay Chataway's interview in the first book, I think we talked specifically about that. And his kind of point of view was, when you get to something like the Marvel movies, for instance, and they start temping, everybody starts temping with the same stuff, then just automatically all the scores end up going to feel similar, because if they're all, if all the composers are listening to the same temp scores or the same cues in each temp score. I remember when the first book came out, I did an interview for a podcast, and I want to say it was the one I did with Larry Fessenden. He kind of came on as well, because he wrote the foreword for the first book. So he kind of did a podcast as a co-guest with me for the first book. And I don't know if it was on the podcast or before we started rolling. He was telling me how he was involved with some film festival. So he was watching, all the films that were applying to be in the film festival. And when filmmakers do that, the films aren't finished. And so he's just like, if I hear another, if I watch another horror movie with temp scores from It Follows,
some Claire de Lune slapped in there or something,
is like everybody, whatever's popular at the time, everybody starts kind of temping with that, I guess. And it can, I guess, lead to what most people would consider kind of a lack of originality. But that's the theory behind it. I don't know how much I agree with it, but I think that's the point of view for that argument.
Yeah. Man, get a little sidetracked here. Larry Fessenden just seems like so cool. Like everything I've seen from him, all the interviews, podcasts, just seems like a super cool guy. So please don't tell me if he's a monster behind the scenes. I don't want that to ruin my illusion of him.
Who?
Larry Fessenden.
No, he's great. I've
He
not,
seems like the coolest.
I've got nothing but appreciation for his support for the first book, and I mean, I've only met him in person once or twice, but he's another instance where I was scrambling to find somebody to write a foreword for the first book, and just like nobody was getting back to me.
Yeah.
And I emailed him at some point just to be like, I was just emailing out to anybody I would want. I would love to have write a forward to it. You know, like I remember when I did the first book, my publisher's like, do you know anybody that can write it? I said, no. He's like, well, you're not going to get, I was like, I was just going to start emailing people and asking. He's like, well, if you don't know them, they're not going to do it. I was like, yeah, but if I had that mentality, the books never would have gotten written, you know, like,
Right. Yeah.
you know, like I just emailed composers out of the blue and I said, this is what I'm doing. You want to participate? So I was looking for people to write the forward and nobody did. And I never heard back from Larry either. But then like the day before the manuscript was due, I got an email from Larry saying, I don't know how I missed your email. I apologize. I'm happy to do it. When do you need it? And I emailed my publisher and I was like, so I got back to him and it was like a Friday. He's like, I need it Monday. He's like, okay, I'll email it to you on Monday.
No pressure though.
Yeah. So Larry's great.
So on the first book, I'm looking at it right now. There's a Joe Bob Briggs like little kind of pull quote on the front. Was that a similar situation where you just kind of emailed him, or did you know him from something beforehand?
I had, I'm very honored to say that I got that before the last drive-in. So it's before the resurgence of Joe Bob. I worked for a bit on special features for DVDs before the Blu-ray thing, before Scream Factory and all that. There was a company in LA, I think called Automat Pictures, and they would hire a friend of mine to do interviews to produce DVD extra features when the people that needed to be interviewed were in New York. And so my friend Steven would often hire me to come on set and kind of be a PA. But what it turned out was when it was a subject matter that he thought I would be knowledgeable about and he wasn't, he would hire me to come and be the PA, but he would interview me before, like as we were setting everything up, before the person would come in.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
And we were doing an interview for the first DVD release of the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And we spoke to an expert on Ed Gein, and Joe Bob came in. And he emailed me like on Friday. He's like, we're interviewing Joe Bob on Monday. Do you want to come and do it with me? And I said, yeah, sure. And he's like, Joe Bob has a book out called Profoundly Disturbing. Can you get a copy and read it for Monday? Because I don't have time. I was like, okay. So I got Joe Bob's book. I read it. And so my job Monday ended up being like just like babysitting Joe Bob Briggs for like an afternoon. Because they were also going to shoot something else for a sizzle, because they were trying to sell a TV show based on Profoundly Disturbing. So they made a deal where they would shoot the interview, but then they would shoot something else for him. So there was a lot of like in between setups and stuff. And so like my job was just to kind of like keep Joe Bob company and, get him stuff if he needed it, if he wanted it, and just kind of like chat with him to keep him busy.
I think a lot of fans would give like their left leg for that opportunity. This sounds like the best job.
I was a huge Monster Vision fan. So by that point, Monster Vision was off the air, but I remember getting in the elevator with him and being like, so do I call you John or Joe Bob? He's like, you can call me John. And he was totally not Joe Bob until he put on his bolo tie and sat in the chair. And then all of a sudden Joe Bob appeared. It was kind of mad.
Yeah, magic trick.
It was magical. So when I did the book, I had his email address from that experience. And I just emailed him and I said, hey, we did this 10 years ago or whatever it was. It was a long time. I said, I know you don't remember it, but I'm writing a book. I was wondering if you would write a blurb for it, because he's an author and a writer. And he got back to me. He said, sure. So I sent him kind of a PDF of where the book was at the time, and he was nice enough to write up a blurb.
Oh, that's great. Small aside, I like to brag about this every time I can. Going back to Ed Gein. So I'm in Wisconsin, and my grandfather actually took crime scene photos at the Ed Gein house, like when he was arrested. So it was our family heirloom for a long time. We had negatives of like the hearts on the boiler, on the stove, and meat hooks in the garage, and just the entire place.
Well, that was when I sat and they interviewed this expert on Ed Gein for like 2.5 hours. The guy was a real trooper and fascinating. And we would get a hotel room in New York City to do these things, and they would kind of just pay for the room for the app. They found a place in a nice hotel, and because it's New York, I guess they're used to this kind of thing where you could rent it for like the day, but not the night.
Oh,
And
okay.
it wasn't like a seedy motel where you pay by the hour, but it was like they knew that that's what we were doing, so they would put us in like a wing of the hotel where there wasn't a lot of guests, so it would be quiet. But so I would just sit and like off to the side and during these interviews, and listen to the interviews because I wasn't conducting. And the most fascinating part about that Ed Gein interview was the guy talking about how when the cops and everybody went in to get him, it was night, and Ed Gein didn't have electricity. So they were really going through the house and the barn and stuff with like flashlights. and
the most stereotypical setup possible for a horror film.
And discovering these atrocities and like, skull thing, in the skull bowls that he made and all this crazy stuff. And then
belts made of nipples, and it was just it was as gruesome as you'd imagine.
And so I'm not the biggest fan of the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I do love that they try to capture like that aspect of it with like the kind of newsreel, like the cop footage that kind of bookends the movie, because that was the thing I thought was like the creepiest part of the whole story when the guy was telling it, was that like these cops and everybody, and I guess your relative who took these pictures, they all went in at night without any light, and which had to kind of investigate in the dark, which just sounds like the creepiest thing ever.
Right. He passed before I got to know him at all, so I never got to ask questions about that. But yeah, he was just a newspaper reporter on the scene. They got a call like, "Hey, we need pictures." So he got called in, take crime scene photos, and had no idea what he's in for. So I can't even imagine.
None of them did.
Anyone, right? Yeah. Just imagine like that in real life. Oh my God.
Thankfully, you still have his beloved lamp, unrelated. Oh, it's still as pearly white as the day gave it to me.
So I can't get my head out of the disaster piece section of the book because I reread that last night just to get up for it, and I absolutely love his music from Hyper Light Drifter. So I was really excited when all the It Follows stuff was out there.
Well, he was, It Follows came out when I was in the last leg of the first book.
Yeah.
And I didn't know who he was. I'm not a video game guy. And, you just see the name Disaster Piece on a credit. And I didn't know who it was. I remember walking out of the movie theater on 42nd Street in New York City and walking home to my apartment and thinking like, I'm kind of done the book, but I haven't handed it in yet. Should I try to reach out to this person, this band, like whoever this Disaster Piece is? I don't know if it's a man, it's a woman, if it's a collective of people.
Yeah.
And I was like, should I try to reach out to them? Because the score, just like, obviously it became such a big thing, but just like on my first viewing, it was like, wow, like maybe I should try to talk to this person. And ultimately I ended up deciding that like, it just wasn't feasible. The book was going to be due too soon. And, it just like, it wasn't going to work out. I just realized it just wasn't going to happen. But that was definitely like my immediate reaction was like, I think I might need to put this person in this book or whoever it is. But I didn't end up reaching out to him, but I really wanted to. And it just didn't seem possible. And it was just like he'd only done one kind of horror movie at that point. And
right, how do you make 20 pages of interview out of necessarily one genre project?
I ended up being able to kind of figure out how to do that, but it took a couple years. So when I had the opportunity to do the second book, there's a long kind of convoluted story about how the second book came about. But what I will say is that the second book, the half of the interviews of the second book are originated as part of Scored to Death, the podcast, which I kind of did between the two books. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I did that was because basically like I wasn't going to make as much money on the second book as I was in the first book, and so I didn't want to put as much work into it. So
Gotcha.
but I said like, hey, like I have this collection of fantastic interviews that I did for the podcasts. So I asked my publisher, can I use them? And they said, sure. So half the book, the second book, originated as podcast episodes that I then did some follow-up interviews for to have kind of unique information that was specific to the book.
Mhm.
But then it became like, okay, so if this many interviews kind of already exist, I've already done most of that work, but who else do I want to put in it? And so, Disasterpiece was one of the, if not the first, it was certainly one of the very first people that popped in mind for me to reach out to for the second book because of how I felt seeing the movie when I was doing the first book. And I love that interview because, because his body of work is, especially at that point, was so much smaller than a lot of other people's. Michael Abels is the same way in the second book. That I got to explore like one or two scores in a much more in-depth way than I did with a lot of the other composers.
Oh yeah.
So they have a very different vibe. The talking about like Get Out with Michael Abels and It Follows with Disasterpiece. It's almost like a track or cue by cue like discussion about like each piece of music in it, which was fascinating to do, and it ended up being like they feel so much different than the other interviews. And that's what
great.
I love.
There's a moment in there where you get to specifically talk about just like title, where that goes and where it came from and why it plays so late in the movie. So I love that, just really super laser focused on one track. That's fantastic when you can get that.
Yeah. That was, that all that stuff was kind of obviously not by design for the books. Those are the things that just kind of happened. And by making the conversations, it allowed each of the interviews to have its own energy, its own rhythm, its own focus in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the things that really works about the books is not just the people that are in them, but that each interview has its own kind of life. Like with Bear McCreary in the second book, I only had Bear for an hour. It was a strict hour. I was told not to go over it by his publicist. And I don't even think we talk about any specific movie in it. I think we just talk about kind of like writing music for movies, and his relationship with mentors and stuff. But Bear is a rare occasion where like Bear has a blog where he writes about everything himself. He writes about like almost every project. So the way I felt comfortable with it because I felt like Bear's kind of already done that like for every project. So I didn't feel bad about like not being able to talk to him about, some of the specific movies and scores that I love of his. Because I feel like he's very vocal online about all that stuff. So all that information is out there. So what I will do is I will try to focus on all the stuff that all those other interviews and all his blog posts don't focus on, so that it can kind of be a nice complement to all the other information that already exists. So, and those were just all things that ended up coming out of just doing them. But yeah, the Disasterpiece interview, I kind of love for that reason, because its focus is so different than the majority of the other interviews in the book.
Right. Well, and there were two things that caught me with it. One was the fact that everyone goes, oh, it's just kind of Carpenter throwback retro music, which I'm sure I probably said at one point too, when I wasn't thinking about it. And then you realize like, well, he's using a synthesizer, but that's kind of where the similarities end between his music and a lot of the other stuff out there that's being compared to or even inspired.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really not, which is what's amazing. And I didn't, because like that was my inclination too, until I went back and I listened to the score and I rewatched the movie for the interview, and I realized like, no, this really isn't like a John Carpenter ripoff,
No, not at all. It's just the music. I like the instrument, I guess.
Yeah, it's the instrument, but I also, something we talked about, I think in the interviews, I brought it up. I said, like, I think where some of that comparison comes from is the way the filmmakers decide to use the music. Also, I think is part of why people associate it with John Carpenter. Like, it's not the music itself, but it's the role that the music plays within the movie and the narrative that I think is also kind of reminiscent to what we think of with John Carpenter. And that was kind of an interesting revelation and an interesting thing to talk to him about, because I think, obviously as the guy that did it, he doesn't see it as like a very John Carpenter-esque score. And it's really not when you listen to it. The sounds that he uses are very different. And even his approach to the sound of the music is very different than what John Carpenter does. But I think in the context of the movie and how the music is used, I see even more so why people make those connections.
Right. And he wasn't even a huge genre fan, I believe. In the conversation, he kind of mentions he was aware of things like The Shining, but he wasn't well versed in them. He wouldn't call himself a horror fanboy. So that's, I think, a whole different area of approach as well when you're not kind of mired in horror score tradition. Yeah,
he was familiar with the band Goblin, but not because of like their horror movies. It was just like through the the online community of music, of musicians and like bit music composers and stuff, that he discovered them completely away from Dario Argento and stuff, and just discovered the music on its own. But yeah, he was not a huge horror guy, and therefore not totally familiar with the conventions of horror scores.
And the other thing that I took away from that interview was when I saw It Follows, the score was so impressive to me. It was one of those deals where I knew immediately, like, even if the movie is garbage, I hate the rest of the film from this point of this thought, I still need to get my hands on the score. The score is so good, it validates the entire movie existing. And I'm having a hard time thinking of other movies where that happened, where you just listen to the score and go, wow, this is independent and amazing by itself. It's a blessing this exists, even if the rest of the movie is complete garbage.
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, obviously the movie made a big splash, especially at the time. But in a way, like, the score surpassed the popularity of the movie pretty instantly. It was definitely a weird kind of phenomenon with that score.
Yeah, and I like the movie too, but that score really just blew me away. In a slightly related vein would be Carpenter returning for the Halloween score. Like, even if I knew walking into the theater I didn't like Halloween 2018, we're getting new Carpenter music, so I was really excited for that part, and the score absolutely knocked me over. So that was a joy that I happen to like the movie and the score.
Yeah. I'm not as in love with the new Halloween movies as everybody else, but I do love the scores.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Even if you don't care for the film, at least we got the music, and in some cases, that's enough for me.
Yeah, and it's also, somebody commented on a tweet that I did yesterday. I actually liked Kills and Ends just fine. I was not a fan of 2018's Halloween, but somebody commented, like, will somebody tell me what it is that Cody and Daniel Davies are doing, because I don't hear it. Like, and I think that's the beauty of that, of at least the first one, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, because I haven't really listened to Ends yet by itself, because I think it just came out by itself, and the movie obviously just came out. But like,
I think you can get on Spotify like right now, but I think that's pretty much now.
Like, I think, like, and especially when you get familiar with the Lost Themes albums that they did together, and I've interviewed Cody a few times. I've become friendly with Cody, and so getting to know Cody's music and Daniel's music kind of separate from the Carpenter related stuff, like, you really can hear like their influence on the scores too. And I think that's also is a huge plus for those scores. John Carpenter was always, what we think of as the John Carpenter sound was always a hybrid of him and whoever he was working with at the time. He always had collaborators. Dan Wyman with the first few scores, like Halloween and Assault on Precinct 13, and then Alan Howarth throughout the 80s, and then Shirley Walker and Jim Lang. Obviously Carpenter's the director, so his influence on the music is kind of paramount. But what we think of as John Carpenter music has always really been a very harmonious hybrid with whoever he's working with at the time. And I think one of the great things about the new Halloween scores is the fact that Cody and Daniel Davies are, his son Cody Carpenter and Daniel Davies are collaborating with him, because I think it's making them, it's giving them a voice that I think is really unique to his other stuff. But because they're playing like in the playground of music that John Carpenter built and working off of themes that he created, like it's awesome. It's still at the same time so John Carpenter-esque. But
Yeah, Cody Carpenter's music is so in the same vein of his father's, but so very, very distinct. It's got so much more of a bigger, more fantasy sound to it. Like those Lost Themes albums are very Cody Carpenter when you can
Yeah.
learn to hear the difference.
Yeah, well, he's an extremely talented piano player, keyboard player. So when you hear a cue on the first Halloween, the 2018 album, I think it's called like The Shape Hunts Allison or something like that, and it's just like this repeating arpeggio of keyboards, but it's so Cody. Like John would never be able to play that, let alone write that. You know, so it's like that cue is amazing, but it's got Cody Carpenter written all over it, and then you get like these bowed guitar sounds that are very Daniel. Those scores are great because it's the three of them. I mean, I'm sure John would have delivered, very awesome scores, and we all would have, been chomping at the bit to hear them. But I think what makes those scores special is that he's working with those two guys that he's obviously extremely close to, because one of his son, and Daniel is like his godson, or a very close part of the family as well. Those scores are great. But that's the beauty of music, so many of the composers that I've talked to, they do work alone, but it's but even then it's a collaboration with the filmmakers, but do you get instances with like Goblin, for instance, which is a band that's creating music. Those dynamics when it comes to music are always really, I'm a musician as well. So like those kind of dynamics are always really fascinating to me, and how they're able to do that in the realm of film music is also really interesting.
I'm really curious what the next kind of trend would be. Because right now it feels like everyone either wants to get John Carpenter for their movie or make a John Carpenter type sound. Mm-hmm. So what's it going to be next after people move on? They don't necessarily want something that's synth heavy or some sort of imitation Carpenter.
It's really going to
depend. You have the answer. I'm just throwing that out.
Yeah.
Predict the future.
Yeah, well, nostalgia is big, and I think part of that's coming. The nostalgia for the 80s has lasted way longer than it should have. And I say that because like all that comes from the people that were young in the 80s are now in the position to create things now. And you saw that in the late 70s and the early 80s with guys like John Carpenter and George Romero and even Gary Marshall, like Happy Days and like Grease existed because of nostalgia, and George Lucas with American Graffiti. But then in the 80s we started to get like Creepshow, which was a total homage to EC Comics, which were what George Romero and Stephen King grew up with. But then we saw all these remakes of John Carpenter's The Thing. That was a remake. And Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1978, a remake of a 50s sci-fi movie. The Fly by Cronenberg was a remake of The Blob in the 80s. So like it was these guys who were all nostalgic for the 50s. So we should really be by this point firmly planted in 90s nostalgia. But
I was thinking that the other day, yeah. Well, we're kind of getting it. We got a Scream Legacy sequel. I don't know what the correct term for that is, where it's kind of a remake, kind of the same thing again.
I mean, Are You Afraid of the Dark is back. We can count that.
Yeah.
It's getting there. It's starting, but it should have started like 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah. We don't have anything on the level of Stranger Things for pure nostalgia hit.
So I think part of the Carpenter thing is that. I think that's part of it. Synthesizers in filmmaking have always been, for the most part, a budgetary decision, and that's why so many horror movies used them in the late 70s and especially in the 80s, because there just wasn't money in the budget for anything bigger. Some people got away with it, like Richard Band ended up doing a totally gorgeous score for House on Sorority Row, which is a pretty pretty but typical slasher movie, a good one, but very much of its ilk. But he ends up delivering this like gorgeous, lush orchestral score for it, which was very atypical. But even Harry Manfredini was, especially with the first two Friday the 13th, there was live orchestral instruments, even though the ensembles weren't as big as a full orchestra. And the sad fact is that right now, film music budgets are shrinking.
Right.
And the only scores that can really afford to have live players and orchestras and stuff are the bigger studio pictures, like the Marvel movies and even like the Conjuring movies, which are, I think, Warner Brothers films. Even though they're kind of produced by, Blumhouse or smaller companies, they're still studio pictures. So unfortunately, the budgets aren't there. So the plus side is technology has gotten better in music, that synthetic orchestras can sound pretty good now, and in the right hands can not be really even detectable by most viewers and listeners. But I think part of the synth stuff is it's nostalgia, but it's always going to be budgetary as well. And so I don't know if it'll change anytime soon. I mean, hopefully we'll get away from the Carpenter-esque stuff and things will find their own voice, whatever's next for film music. But for horror that isn't, big studio horror, which even the big studio horror isn't that big, I don't foresee like a huge change in terms of moving back to orchestra. Joseph Bishara gets to do it, but that's because he's working on like the Insidious and Conjuring movies, and Bear gets to do it for a lot of projects, Bear McCreary. But it's not as common as it used to be. And in a way it's sad because, it would be nice to get that kind of stuff too. And hopefully we'll get back to that, but it's going to cost money. And I just don't know if the money's there for low budget horror movies.
Yeah.
Medium ones.
I'm sure we're going to have AI orchestras scaring the shit out of us in a couple of years.
Yeah, you'll just be like, horror genre, 3 minutes.
Yeah, the AI diffuser, you just plug in 3, I want spooky, make me shiver, and take Black Cats, and it'll just spit out a song for you.
And it'll take 1 minute to scan the scene and then put like the jump scare in the right place for you, and it'll all work out.
Hey, this is just the Shining score again. Gives.
It'd probably be great for Mickey Mousing, though. Come on. So for Harry Manfredini, was he relieved when you had questions for scores that weren't Friday the 13th? I imagine that poor man has had to have talked about those movies more times than he's ever wanted to in his entire life.
Well, let's put it this way. When I emailed Harry to do the first book, I originally thought, in a quick aside, when I did the first book, I was like, I wasn't sure I was the right guy to do that book. The few books I had read of interviews with film music composers were a little bit music theory heavy, and I wasn't sure like I could do that. And so I made a decision that I would do like 2 interviews and see how they turned out. And if I thought they were good enough, I would continue with the book. And if they weren't good enough, then I would edit them down and give them to, like Fangoria or Dread Central or someplace to post them as their own things. Yeah. So to do that, I assuming that most people would say no, I reached out to like 7 or 8 composers thinking that maybe I'd get 2 to say yes. But all of them said yes.
You're doing the book whether you want to or not.
Yeah, so it became pretty clear that the book was happening. Or at least, I don't know, it wasn't clear that it would get published, but it was clear that I was going to be doing one. And I emailed Harry, and he was the first interview I did, so I hadn't really done any yet. So he asked me, how long do you need? Like, how much time? And I said, I don't know, 45 minutes? That seemed like a good number to me, 45 minutes to an hour.
Yeah.
And his response was, oh, I'm going to talk a lot longer than that. So, so I talked to Harry. He was in LA. So I talked to Harry like, I'm in New York. So I talked to him at like midnight. It was like 9 his time.
Yeah.
And we talked for like 2.5 hours. And thank God, because it set the pace of what the rest of the interviews were going to be. Like if I talked to Harry and we talked for 45 minutes, that's how long the rest of the interviews would have been. But because I talked for like 2.5 hours with Harry, and then the next day talked for like 2 hours with Alan Howarth, it was like, okay, like these are 2 hours is the benchmark of how long these are going to be. So Harry's a talker, happy to talk about stuff. I think, yes, probably more happy to not talk about Friday the 13th, but he understands that he kind of has to. And what I did get to do with what I'm getting to do with the movie that I didn't really do too much in the book, and you can see it with the Bernard Herrmann video that I posted on social media, is that I get to talk to them about other people's music more than I did with the books. The books were really focused on them and their work and how they approach it and how they got to be composers and all that stuff. But to be able to sit down and be like, okay, because like really part of what I want to do with the movie is highlight some of the greatest scores in the genre. So to talk to Harry Manfredini about the Halloween score and about Bernard Herrmann and about Jerry Goldsmith and about, you know, the use of tubular bells in The Exorcist, to talk to these guys about those things, I think they're happy to talk about other people other than themselves as well, especially Jerry Goldsmith, because in most film composers, especially of his generation, Charles Bernstein, Harry Manfredini, Chris Young, like Jerry Goldsmith was their benchmark of, you know, like he's on Mount Rushmore of film scores composers for them. So for them to be able to talk about Jerry Goldsmith, you can tell they light up to talk about these guys. So yeah, but Harry's always willing to talk, always willing to lend his support. I did a convention trying to sell the book in California, and to get people to come to the table, I think Chris Young came on Saturday and just sat and signed books with me, and then Harry came on Sunday to sign books with me. So, and they both those guys, I did a signing out there when the book came out, and 5 of the composers showed up for that. So they're all super amazing and supportive and great to talking with their fans and stuff. Yeah, I mean, Harry's known for Friday the 13th, but he's done the House movies, and those are fun to talk to him about. And, you know, Swamp Thing.
Those have a pretty good, those guys. I mean, the House movies have pretty good following, so it's a little bit of a bummer they're overshadowed by, you know, some of the bigger things like Friday the 13th. That's Swamp Thing. Oh, Swamp Thing.
In that same vein, we were talking a little bit about like Diamond in the Rough scores earlier. Were there any lesser known composers you were able to interview in either book that you really enjoyed being able to shine a bigger spotlight on?
Absolutely. I mean, it was really important for me to put Jay Chataway in the first book because I loved his score for Maniac, the Bill Lustig 1980 film.
Yeah.
When I was getting into horror movie scores in a really serious way in the late 90s, you know, John Carpenter was big for me. I was discovering the Italian horror stuff. So Goblin was getting very big for me in the late 90s, and Fabio Frizzi. All this was the stuff that ended up leading to me doing the book in 2013, was being in film school and discovering all these movies and these scores. And at that point, Anchor Bay had put out Maniac on VHS because Bill Lustig was working with Anchor Bay. So to kind of like get the materials to re-release all these, they were doing what like Scream Factory and Arrow do now, but they were doing it on VHS. And
doing
so
the Lord's work.
Yeah, they were releasing widescreen on VHS versions of Fulci movies and Mario Bava and all that stuff. So I saw Maniac and just instantly fell in love with that score. And then learned that he did the score for Silver Bullet, which is a movie that as an adult, oddly enough, has become one of my favorite movies of all time.
Silver Bullet is very underrated.
It's weird. It's a beautiful movie about a kid and his handicapped kid and his sister, you know, and his crazy uncle. Like it's this beautiful love story about this family with a werewolf.
It's like the Stephen King Spielberg movie. I love it.
Somebody once said it's like To Kill a Mockingbird, but with werewolves, and I was like, yeah, kind of. And so Jade Chataway was a big deal, and for me in the first book. With the second book, I had the extreme honor of interviewing Robert Cobert, who is not known to a lot of people now, but he wrote the music for the original Dark Shadows television series. He scored the original TV movies of Kolchak the Night Stalker before it became a series. He did trilogy. Wow. He scored Trilogy of Terror, which is probably one of the bigger things that people know now because the little doll and Karen Black segment of that movie. He was I think he was 94 when I interviewed him, and sadly died in early 2002, kind of 2020, right before COVID kind of hit. And so he unfortunately passed away before the book was released. And it was amazing. And, certainly certainly like I was aware that it was important in a way that I didn't feel about the other ones, because I was like, this guy, like, I kind of felt like he might not be around by the time the book comes out. Like, this is like, I need to preserve this guy's story in a weird, like, historical way. Like, there were stakes to it. And I felt, and getting the interview was kind of funny and weird. And he was such a funny guy. And we sat and we talked for like 2 hours on the phone because he didn't have Skype or anything like that. And we just laughed, and he took this walk down memory lane and thought about things that he clearly hadn't thought about in decades. Like, he was telling me stories about being a teenager and playing in a jazz band in the Catskills, and like spending the summer trying to get laid. And it was, he had like the mouth of a sailor and was sharp as a tack. And he didn't want to do the interview at first. And he came around and did it. And he ended up like having the best time. And we stayed friends after that. And I would call him. And then I called him like the following Christmas or the Christmas of 2019. And I didn't hear back from him. And I was kind of worried. And then I found out that he died in February. So yeah, it was important to me to shine light on some of these composers and some of the music. That was the best. And that came about whereas like I was just sitting at the time when I was working on the second book, my desk at that point was kind of like facing my Blu-rays and my DVDs. And I was trying to compile a list of who I wanted to talk to for the second book, who I was going to try to reach out to. And I just saw like Burnt Offerings on the shelf, the Oliver Reed movie. And I was like, who did the score for that? And I looked it up and I was like, okay, Robert Kober. What else did he do? I was like, oh, Dark Shadows, Trilogy of Terror. I was like, I'm going to try to find that guy. Then I looked him up online. I was like, oh shit, he's in his 90s. It's like, how am I going to find him? He's not going to be on social media. He's not going to have an agent at this point. But miraculously, I found him. A lot of hunting. A big part of the book is kind of being a detective, honestly, and trying to find people is a big part of doing it. And he was the best. So those are the two from the first and the second book that come immediately to mind, of kind of like the diamonds in the rough composers that maybe not a lot of people know by name, but probably know the music, but their music isn't as iconic as say like the Halloween score or something like that.
Just as a reader, those are always the best interviews to stumble onto, because it's like, I've seen Danny Elfman interviewed 1,000 times, and we'll see him interviewed 1,000 times more before he's gone. But God, to find an interview with the composer to The Night Stalker, it's like, God, tell me those stories.
Yeah, well, he's also working at a bygone era of film and television. Like he stopped scoring things in like the 90s, so he started scoring stuff in like the 50s. So it was a totally different, his outlook on it, how he did it. It was totally different. So part of the goal for both books was diversity. With the second book, times had changed a little bit, and so things like racial, ethnic diversity, gender diversity were more of a factor with the second book than the first book, because the first book I was just trying to get whoever I could get, and just wanting to talk to the people who scored some of the greatest, the most iconic horror movie franchise of all time, and they were all white dudes because of various circumstances. But in both books, diversity was a big thing, stylistically, age, all those things. I wanted to cast like wide nets of who was going to be interviewed, so that I was covering all kinds of different approaches, and some were synth guys, some were rock guys that became film composers, some were classical guys, some guys started in the 70s and 80s, other guys started in the 90s and 2000s. So yeah, I wanted to interview people who weren't, like Holly Amber Church in the second book. It was important for me to get her not because she's a woman, but because she is contemporary. And at that point, now her career starting to take off, but she had scored a ton of like lower independent type horror movies of today, of like the last 10 years. And in the way that Jeff Grace kind of like filled that slot for me in the first book with scoring, Ty West's movies, earlier movies. Like Holly Amber Church was like checking this box of like working on ultra low budget horror and not, that's contemporary. Like all that stuff was really important to me. And a lot of it was strategic in that way. Like I want to talk to Bear McCreary, who's, scoring some of the biggest television shows and movies. But I also want to talk to Holly, who's grinding it out day to day on a smaller project. And now,
Right,
and now finally, I think she wrote the theme for Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, which is coming on Netflix.
Oh.
So it's
that's
also
exciting.
It's also it's nice to have this person who's become kind of a close friend of mine now and see that her career's finally starting to pick up in exciting ways.
Going back to GDT, it's always amazing. I don't know how musical he is as a person, but I think all of his movies have had absolutely phenomenal scores. Even kind of weird stuff like Mimic had pretty good music considering it's a giant bug movie.
Yeah, well, he works with amazing composers. Marco Beltrami is, amazing. And someone who I've tried desperately to get into the second book, and it just didn't work out. We tried to line up our scheduling for over a year. And finally, I just had to say, like, I need to hand in the manuscript. I can't wait any longer.
That's such a bummer.
But he keeps busy, and he's just Guillermo del Toro. One, his movies are, especially the more, you can tell, like the more personal ones, like Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth and stuff. They're poetic in a way that I think lends itself to gorgeous music. And he is very talented at working, at choosing really wonderful composers to work with. And it's a beautiful hybrid of image and story and music, his stuff for sure.
Yeah,
Just remember there. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jamie.
I was just going to say, he's definitely probably the best director working today when it comes to integrating music into his films. Like, they are very much a living, breathing, organic part of his movies that never feel like anything that was added in later. Like, even with something like the Hellboy movies, I could not imagine the first Hellboy having any other theme. It seems like something that sprang out of the movie naturally.
Well, he's you can tell when you hear him talk, or even when you read his tweets, you can tell that he just loves cinema passionately. I mean, all filmmakers do to a certain extent, but you can tell that he's one that just loves it. And so I think he approaches stuff in a lot of ways in a more classical sense. I think a lot of what he's trying to do is tell very classic stories in a very classic style of filmmaking. And, the film music had a very different role in when sound came into play in the 30s and then especially in the 40s into the 50s, these giant orchestras and stuff. I think he just approaches film in that way. So I think he's more in tune with like the power of music in that kind of classical sense, because I think he's really trying to like harkening back to like a bygone era of cinema, even though his movies are clearly him. Like talk about an auteur, but like I think he's definitely got kind of more classic sensibilities, and music just played a different role in cinema then than it does in a lot of contemporary cinema. So I think that's why his music kind of stands out so much.
I remember, I believe this was an interview with Bill Traumer where he's talking about working with Del Toro on Hellboy, and just some of the ideas Del Toro would throw at him, like, okay, this one, I want a tango for this scene when he's on the rooftop spying on his love, because it should be kind of romantic and a little playful, which is something Bill Traumer, I believe, said he hadn't considered. Like, yeah, why would I put a tango in this monster movie? Or there's another scene, an action scene where, the monster is throwing Hellboy around, and Del Toro told him, okay, now make it sound like an orchestra fell down an elevator.
Yeah, well, I think even as like a young man, I'm not positive about this, but I think like he wrote like a book about Alfred Hitchcock in his movies like before he became a filmmaker. I mean, it was in Spanish.
Oh,
I've
wow.
tried to find a copy of it. So I mean, talk about, you know, a relationship between a director and a composer, Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock. And Bernard Herrmann was an outlier in his, you know, in his generation, you know, scoring things in ways that nobody would have imagined, using,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Psycho is nothing but strings, kind of realizing before Bernard Herrmann, for the most part, obviously there might be exceptions that I'm not thinking of, but like I feel like, and I think Chris Young talks about this in the first book, like before that, like composers were working with whatever like the standard, you know, lineup of an orchestra was, and they were scoring it as if it could be performed in a classical concert, you know, somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
They were working in but Bernard Herrmann came around and he was thinking, you know, like this is not going to be performed in like Central Park as part of a concert. Like this is for a movie. Like if I can have, you know, 40 flutes, then, you know, I'm going to use it if I think it's going to work. And, so I, you know, that's an instance where I think, you know, I think that's some of the stuff that you're talking about, these examples with like Guillermo del Toro and working with Marco Beltrami and using a tango and stuff. I mean, that's, you know, having it sound like an orchestra fell down a flight of stairs. Like that's, to me, that kind of reeks of Bernard Herrmann, the kinds of things that he was doing, being unconventional, with what he was doing, especially in the Hitchcock movies. And I think that's like, I think that just goes back to what I was saying. Like, I think Guillermo del Toro is just like approaching music, how music works in movies, in a way that some of his contemporaries aren't.
Yeah. Before we wrap it up, we should one more time just impress everyone that the Kickstarter goes until November 1st, correct?
It does. I mean, I've talked to Kickstarter, and if like we haven't reached our goal and maybe we're close, there's a possibility that we might be able to extend it by a little bit. But, you know, I just don't know if that's going to happen. So, yeah, we're hoping that we'll be able to reach our goal by November 1st, which is just at the time of recording, just about 2 weeks away. So we're running out of time.
So no pressure, folks. But if you listen to this podcast and then don't immediately pledge your money, you're a bad person. Just how it works. So everyone, make sure to go to Kickstarter right now. You're going to want to look up Scored to Death movie and plop your money down. You're going to appreciate it in the end. I'm very excited for it too. So you're going to be letting me down if you don't put your money on this, because I want all the interviews possible. But Blake, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much for the time. I really loved having you on the show. Where can people find you on Twitter?
On Twitter, Instagram,
whatever your preferred social medias are.
At Scored to Death. And the books are available on Amazon from other book retailers, or from me directly at scoredtodeath.com. Or you can join the mailing lists at scoredtodeath.com to, you know, stay up to date with what's going on with the movie. Or, you know, I try to, especially during the Kickstarter, I've been trying to post videos and things like that to give everybody a sense of what, hopefully what the movie potentially can be. So you can go to at Scored to Death on Twitter and Instagram and stuff, and take a look at those videos so you can see what we're doing. And I also do a podcast called Scored to Death Radio for the Cinematic Sound Radio Network, where I've been kind of branching out lately, but for the most part, it's been like I play DJ for a day and I play horror movie cues. But I just wrapped up a gigantic 5-part kind of series about the band Goblin, where I painstakingly go through the history of their music. And for Halloween season, I just did what I'm calling a supersize slash-a-thon, where we did a massive 2.5-hour episode just talking about the music of the late 90s slasher boom, playing things by Marco Beltrami for Scream and Scream 2, and even Mimic, which we were just talking about. We have debuting a suite of music that from Urban Legend that Chris Young put together, that he is so graciously letting me play on the show, and all kinds of other stuff. So, and I'm doing that with the wonderful Rachel Reeves, kind of co-hosts that 90s episode with me. And of course,
I was listening to that over lunch, and it turns out the H20 score, fantastic motivator to get work done. You feel like there's someone behind you the whole time.
And Score to Death, the Dark Art of Scary Movie music is on Kickstarter. It's a lot of interesting tier rewards, including the album that we talked about 4 hours ago when we started this episode. And help make the film a reality. And if you can't contribute financially, please spread the word. That is also extremely important and supportive. Letting other people know it exists through social media and whatnot. It's extremely helpful.
You're the man. Get out there and start canvassing. Folks, this has been Box Office Pulp. We hope you had a good time. Thank you for listening. Get the hell out of here.
Oh God, who shot the conductor?
And like that, he's gone.
This is Box Office Pulp Guy, and this has been a Pulp Podcast production. Now please, 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 put a gun in my mouth and pull the trigger and say goodnight.
And now, on with the show.